Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about a critically important issue in artificial intelligence. How can we build a powerful ethical framework into AI, a technology that is well on its way to altering so many aspects of business and culture? To discuss that, I'm joined by two major industry thought leaders. With me is Kathy Baxter, Principal Architect, Ethical AI Practice at Salesforce. Kathy, hello to you.
Hey, how are you?
Good, good. I'm glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Also with me is Zia Khan, Senior Vice President, Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation. Zia, good to have you with us.
Great. Hi, James. It's wonderful to join you and Kath for this conversation. Thanks.
All right. So, I mean, when you get to the issue of ethics and AI, it's some big thorny topics. I mean, I wonder, why are we not already there in a sense? Why don't we already have the ethical framework in place? I know there's a lot of answers to that. Investment, the technology itself, cultural changes. What do you see as some of the more difficult challenges facing the development of an ethical framework for AI? Kathy, what is your sense of that?
I think one of the most difficult questions is around safe thresholds. Some regulation has talked about having bias-free data sets and models, and that's just not possible. If you do somehow have statistics or analysis that says that a model is 100% bias-free, it's probably overfitting and not a good model. And sometimes we intentionally will add bias. Some people might refer to it as positive bias to a model to help address social inequities or historical bias. And so when we talk about measuring the amount of bias or saying when an AI system is safe to be released into the world, we just don't have good ideas of exactly how much is safe. What should it look like in the lab where we feel comfortable that this is going to be okay in the wild? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're trying to figure out right now, and we just don't have the answers to it.
So really the data scientists, the AI engineers are building in possibly a way to make up for some social inequality
Yes.
oh, that's really interesting. See, it sounds like a very tricky process.
It is. There are over 21 different statistical definitions of fairness, and research has shown when you attempt to optimize for one definition of fairness, it might improve the outcomes for one group, but it might significantly deter the outcomes for another group. And so trying to find that balance of how do you have a model that is accurate and doesn't result in undue disparate impact for certain groups, particularly underrepresented, marginalized, vulnerable groups? We really want to have a close eye on that. And it's again, this is a really difficult problem to try and figure out when AI is out in the world interacting with people with hundreds of thousands or millions of interactions at a time. It can just have tremendous scale that is difficult to keep up with.
Zia, what do you see in terms of some of the more difficult challenges facing an ethical framework for AI?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, and James, because we're comparing and merging two things that operate at very different speeds. We've been talking about ethics since people could sit around a campfire thousands and thousands of years ago, and you could argue that there hasn't been a ton of progress over those centuries.
True.
And then we've got
struggle with the idea of
artificial,
ethics.
and then we have artificial intelligence, which every 3 months, it feels like there's a breakthrough happening. So that's just to compare the relative pace of these things that are now coming together in a very unique way. The reason it's important, though, is it's fine if people, debate around a campfire certain ethical questions. It's a very different thing if all of a sudden those ethics are getting baked into a hiring algorithm that is now being disseminated very quickly. So I mentioned these two different speeds not to rationalize why we haven't resolved them. I think it points at the difficulty, yet the urgency is incredibly high as we see AI evolving from these tailored applications to now becoming a ubiquitous infrastructure technology, in the same way that electricity is, or things like that. So I think there's a certain urgency to figuring this out, and particularly an urgency to move from the discussion and articulation of principles into what does this look like in practice.
Mhm. Speaking of which, of course, one way to create that ethical framework is through regulation, which I think there will likely be continued resistance to that. I mean, there's a lot of money on the line. I mean, some forces may not want to be regulated. For example, the issue of explainability is a real hot button issue that will need to be regulated. And how do you see the AI regulation proceeding? Zia, your take on that?
Well, this always comes out with new technologies. We can look back on when we were first starting to commercialize food, and people wanted no longer were buying from the local farmer they trusted, but from some faraway factory. And we had to regulate what safety looked like, et cetera. So any new technology eventually has to be regulated. I think there's an inference that means big government controlling things and dampening innovation. I don't think that needs to be the case either, though. A regulation can provide a level playing field and a predictable playing field in a way that can unlock innovation as well. And that's something, and Kathy, you probably have a better perspective than I do on it, but it's something that we're sensing a little bit more and more from the private sector, which is actually creating some clarity and predictability around regulation, which we kind of know is probably coming in some shape or form, would be a good step to take forward. So one is, I think regulation is going to be helpful, to innovation and to growing the market, particularly in minimizing the risks and maximizing the benefits. And then two, I don't think regulation necessarily always has to be government regulation. And I think there's other ways to think about regulation. There could be regulatory technologies, there could be industry standards, there could be just a set of values and norms that get built into the profession. So I think we can look at regulation a little more expansively than how people are worried about it.
You kind of give an example there of a non-governmental regulation. I'd be curious a little bit more, like what else besides government would actually regulate AI? Because it's a pretty tough thing to regulate.
I could imagine there could be some industry standards that get set up. There might be just some practice standards that are set up. But there may even be a way where some of the regulatory technologies themselves are outsourced. And what the government is doing is really just kind of ensuring the outcomes and providing some tests, but that regulation itself becomes a source of technical innovation and a new market as well for new tools and such to poke and probe. And we're seeing similar issues when it comes to ESG, regulation in investment markets and things like that. There's a lot of sort of coincident interests. And I think there's a lot of creative opportunity to see how to put in place.
Kathy, your sense of AI regulation, are we getting there? Are we far away? What do you say?
I agree absolutely with everything that Zia said. He's spot on. I think this is something that is going to be needed. We need to have a level playing field for everyone, so it's not just this race to the bottom in the name of profits by any means necessary. I think some of the arguments we've heard from different quarters are if we are playing by a different set of rules, we're leaving money on the table. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders and our employees. So by creating this level playing field, it means that everybody can act responsibly, and there isn't this fear of, well, why am I holding myself to a higher standard when nobody else is as well? And some of the arguments around, well, regulation means we're going to kill innovation, and that's not always the case. Again, as the point was made a moment ago, sometimes this is actually a really good thing. When there are no rules, no regulations in place whatsoever, you can end up with organizations, companies coming up with the fastest, easiest, cheapest solution. That's not necessarily the best solution. And so by putting some constraints in place, you can actually spur a new innovation as a result of that. And I do think we need consistency and predictability. In the US, different states are putting forward different regulations and requirements. And so if you are a company trying to create AI, you need to have all of the different laws and regulations in mind for every state that you're operating in. And also then, globally, if we have different regulations in the EU, from the US, from India, from Japan, that just makes it incredibly difficult to try and operate responsibly in all of those regions.
Do you have a sense that, like what Zia was talking about, that there's an organization besides government that will regulate AI? I mean, can somehow the tech industry itself regulate artificial intelligence?
I think we've seen huge variety in organizations' ability and willingness to self-regulate. I think one influence that can be very powerful is the marketplace itself. So customers demanding that they see, how did you train your model? There's something called model cards, standard that Meg Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, formerly at Google, created. And then also at IBM, they have fact sheets and data sheets. And so having some kind of documentation that purchasing decision makers, public sector individuals, as they're trying to figure out, should we use this AI in decision making, they can ask for this documentation and say, tell me, how did you train this model? Is it representative of everyone that's going to get impacted by this? How did you look for bias? What kinds of bias? What did you find? What are the intended and unintended consequences and use cases? So by having that kind of standard, that might not be a legal standard, but it becomes something that companies or the government, when they're making purchasing decisions, ask for just as a standard themselves, that can also raise the bar.
I think that's, maybe you use the magical phrase there, purchasing decisions, and that the industry will police itself partially because of they want the reputational advantage of knowing that they're going on the up and up.
Yeah.
I'm curious to get your sense of any advice for organizations and companies that want to ensure that they build ethics into their AI deployment. In other words, what would it take to move from discussion to actual action when it comes to ethical frameworks for AI? Zia, your sense of this?
You know, it's a great question, because I think one of the particular challenges with AI is whatever we put in place right now, we want to make sure it adapts and evolves as we go forward. And so just to, I'll come back to your question more specifically, but just as a minor segue, if you were to look at it through the lens of, say, safety, for example, if you look at the transportation industry and planes, they became remarkably safe over the years because they had a pretty good learning loop with a National Transportation Safety Board that put a black box on a plane. If something did go wrong, easy to investigate, see what needs to be fixed and put in place. I'm not saying there's an exact analog to AI, but I think the idea of not being paralyzed by the uncertainty of the future, but building in adaptation along the way would be an important future. And so with that in mind, I think it's just encouraging to see people going forward and trying some things, like what can we do? What can we try? How do we create the learning loop to go back and understand what we're doing? And I think there's lots of interesting efforts that are happening out there in terms of pilot exercises. But coming back to Kathy's point around the risk of fragmented regulatory framework on a state-by-state case, there's also a risk of a patchwork, of regulatory attempts and people self-certifying thing. And then you run into what I call the organic food problem, where there's a million different seals of organic food and the whole notion of organic gets confused and conflated. So at some point, there will be some need for collective action, probably at the federal level here in the US. That's a very interesting question when you look at it globally, given all the geopolitics involved with AI, of like, how can we set some high level standards? So as, we want to let some flowers bloom, but it's not useful to have 1,000 flowers blooming all the time.
Right. Interesting. Kathy, your sense, what would it take to move from discussion to action when it comes to ethical frameworks?
I think one of the things that I found in my personal experience is that many companies have their own principles for what responsible or ethical AI means at their company. And there's been some criticism about that, of everybody creating their own, that it means that you can pick and choose what's most important to you. But I do think that exercise of going through those discussions with the engineers and product teams that are building the AI, all the way up to the executives, as to what are we going to say that are going to guide our decisions for what we will build and what we will not build. That's a first important step of having that conversation across the company. And then the next step that you have to do is to say, okay, now what are the commitments that we'll make? So our principles are responsible, accountable, transparent, empowering, and inclusive. Sounds great, but what does that mean in practice? What are the commitments that we're going to make when we say we will be responsible or we say we will be transparent? And then being able to measure ourselves against that. And that is how that's an important step to keep this from being just virtue signaling or ethics washing to actually turning it into something that's measurable. And then the next step, now we're going to bake this into our development cycle where we have specific checkpoints along the way where we're looking for bias, we're measuring for fairness, we're examining how explainable or interpretable our models are, all of this prior to making the go, no go decision for launch, and then having mechanisms post-market to see, okay, now how is this doing in the wild? This is what we thought it might do. What's it really doing? And having notifications in place. So when it starts to go sideways, you can act upon it before the New York Times headline alerts the rest of the world to it.
You definitely want to beat that New York Times headline. When you can't beat that, you get yourself in trouble. It's kind of funny listening to the two of you. I am feeling more optimistic. I mean, in terms of the years ahead, I have this pessimistic sense that there's so much money involved with artificial intelligence that it's going to be hard to regulate it, hard to build an AI. But some of the solutions the two of you have been mentioning are pretty convincing. Still like to get your sense. What do you see a few years out? Are we going to look back in the middle of the decade and go, we figured out this whole ethics and AI thing? It's, that was an issue back in the early, 2021, but we're done with it now. Zia, what do you see for the future of ethics and AI?
I don't think this issue's going to go away, just like the ethics of card use hasn't gone away. Every technology is going to have its questions. And I think it would be a false stand to say that we're never going to have an ethical debate about AI. But at the very least, what we can do is, stop the most extreme forms of harm and try and capture the big benefits, and not muddle that up. And there, I think, at least what I've sensed is there's a lot more alignment, I think, than there might have been earlier, where I think everyone is recognizing it's in our interest to find some common ground here. And I think there's growing recognition that finding those regulations or figuring out what's best for society is not a technical problem. It's more of a political problem. Mm-hmm. And so I think, what I would phrase, or someone phrased to me, is help us, help you, help us kind of attitude now that a lot of actors are expressing, where civil society knows they don't have the technical chops to make those recommendations, but they can represent and advocate for the poor and vulnerable. Government knows they need to do something. They just don't know what they can do. And I think technology companies, Salesforce is such a leader but are have a moral compass, but also recognize for the market and for the business, it's in our interest. So I'm seeing more convergence, and who is going to be that actor in the middle who can kind of bring everyone together and catalyze this conversation. That's an interesting question. But I'm optimistic about positive steps. Full resolution is a long way off, but that should not prevent us from making positive steps.
Who is that actor in the middle? If you could take a wild guess as to who that organization or entity is going to be.
It's a great question. I have a hunch that, there'll have to be some combination of federal government working with some body of civil society to represent, the interests of many other people. And I don't know if there is emerging, Kathy, you may know of some cross-industry group that's coming together to speak more with one voice. I'm not answering your question. I'm just saying one step from the many, many, many actors to at least some cross-sector representation.
Right. Kathy, your sense when you look into your crystal ball about the future of ethics and AI, will it be solved, or what will it look like in the middle of the decade or so?
I love Zia's comparisons to the food safety industry and transportation. I think another analogy is cybersecurity. And I think we're at the point right now that the cybersecurity was at in the 80s. There was no such thing as cybersecurity. And then the first malware and viruses started hitting, and all of a sudden an entire industry had to spring up and figure out how, what are standards. And we have tons of standards, and we have processes today, like pen testing and red teaming and bug bounties. And we're starting to leverage these things in the ethics community now, where we do ethical red teaming, where we try to act as malicious actors, and how could we use this product or service in an unintended and harmful way. Twitter recently did the first ethical bug bounty. That was incredibly cool. So I think similarly, the cyber security industry, although it's been around for a while, it has to continue evolving, because hacking and bad actors never stop. They never give up, and they're always finding new ways. And so the cybersecurity industry must continue to evolve. And it's going to be the same way with AI. We're going to get in all of these new types of technology and advancements that we might not be able to imagine today, but will bring up new ethical questions that we're going to have to constantly grapple with and figure out. How are we going to identify and respond to these, again, to Zia's point, in a timely manner? We've got to be able to iterate in a way that doesn't require 6 years of argument among different stakeholders before we finally agree on a standard or set of policies.
Kathy, Zia, I think you said it. It's going to be a very interesting field to follow in the years ahead. It's going to definitely affect us in a very big way. I appreciate the two of you coming on and sharing your expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, James. Thank you.